What Trump seems to have learned from 2020 is seize the machines, stop it before those results get
Stop
certified.
the count.
It is on.
Hi, everyone. Today, I've convened a panel of experts to talk about a really crucial topic, how Trump could steal the 2026 midterm elections. What an exciting topic and so not scary at all. The reason I want to do this is because I think there's a lot of scare tactics out there. There's a lot of difficult things happening. There's a lot of crazy stuff. There's a lot of conspiracy theories. So I wanted to have a substantive discussion on what the real risks are and what the real solutions are and what we should be scared of. Voting is a privilege. It is also a right that every American has, no matter what their political affiliation, and it's important to protect that. Natalie, Susan, and Nate, thanks for coming on. Last week, President Trump posted on Truth Social there will be voter ID for the midterm elections, whether approved by Congress or not, exclamation point. Voter impersonation is virtually non-existent, but polls show that 8 out of 10 Americans support voter ID requirements, and emphasizing that some states don't require ID reinforces Trump's narrative that the midterms are rigged. So are you all more concerned with how Trump could weaponize this narrative in the lead up or on election day itself or after the vote during the counting and certification process? Let's hear from you first, Susan, then Nate, and then Natalie.
Well, thank you so much, Kara. It's great to be with you. I think to me it's not an either or question, unfortunately, right? Already what's so striking about the 2026 midterms is Donald Trump's preemptive efforts to undermine it on such a broad front, right? So you have the category that you're talking about, which is to, demand changes essentially in the playing field, in the rules. This has begun, by the way, much earlier, much more persistently, much more specifically than Trump's previous efforts. We all know he's the only president in American history ever to, seek to overturn the results of an election that he decisively lost. But it's much broader than that this time. So he's gone after it earlier. He's seeking to undermine confidence at a minimum. I would say the minimum scenario here for his interference in the election is to seek to undermine the confidence in it, right, and the integrity and that sort of thing. But he's also made these very specific threats like the one that you just mentioned. If only that was even the extent of it, right? The lawyers could just say this is absurd, it's not constitutional, it's not legal. But from my perspective, he's tried to change the rules. He's tried to change the playing field, literally to rewrite the maps, across the country in places that are favorable to him. He's, threatened state and local election officials. He's installed election deniers in key positions in the federal government. So, we could go on, but I think the problem that I'm looking at is that here we are only in February, and we're already in a scenario where it's not if, but when and how Trump is going to seek to undermine our confidence in these elections.
Right. So he's preparing for it like an octopus or whatever. And because people have a long history of thinking elections are lifted, whether it's fictional or in American history. Nate?
Well, in particular, the last decade, right? I mean, Donald Trump actually has said each of the elections, even the ones that he won, was marred by fraud. I mean, we tend to forget that. Even in 2016, he thought that that was a fraudulent election. And so I'm actually less concerned about this particular declaration because I do think the courts would stop him from doing that. But there's a lot of things outside of that that are happening, whether it's DOJ requests for data from the states or whether it's possible messing around with the mail system, let alone threats as to what might happen on election day itself. So these kinds of kind of faux executive orders, the courts are going to be able to handle beforehand. But there's just a lot of uncertainty as to what might be happening in the run up to November.
And Natalie?
Sure. Thanks for having me on. For me, I have a little bit of a different perspective because I do administer elections, and
Exactly.
from my point of view, in California, identification is required when you register, but not when you go to vote in person. We do go through a verification process, particularly with vote by mail, and so for me and for many of my colleagues, if it's not on the books as law, then it's just sort of messaging. But, that said, the messaging does have an effect on our voters. They get confused. Do I need ID? Do I not need ID? And, all of the, sort of messaging that's out there that's coming from the administration can get confusing for people. Surveys show time and again that local elections officials are a trusted voice when it comes to election information. And so, our focus is on making sure that people get the nonpartisan information that they need, because at the end of the day, people just want to vote.
As an election official, do they feel scared of it, or do they just confused? You use the word confused specifically, correct?
I think, some people do feel, very concerned with what they see out there in the news. But, I think for the most part, people are just seeking information, and they want to hear directly from the elections officials. What do I need? Am I registered? Where do I go to vote? And that's where we come in and tell people, hey, if you want to vote, you are welcome to come here. Make sure you're registered. You update your registration if you need to. And you know when Election Day is.
Right. Let's talk about three things the Trump administration has already done to undermine elections. One is seize the ballots in Georgia, demand that Republican states gerrymander, which you referred to, Nate, to create more Republican-leaning House districts, and demand voter data from states. Each of these have varying levels of success, but these are three very specific things in each area. Susan, I want to start with the January FBI raid on the Fulton County election hub. It was based on an affidavit that was full of debunked claims about the 2020 elections. Nonetheless, a judge still signed it, and it's leading to renewed calls in Georgia for the state to take over elections in Fulton County. Walk us through the raid's implications as we look towards the midterms.
Yeah, Kara, I think you're right that it's not just, it's both backward looking. Donald Trump is seeking to put, sort of flesh on the bones of his debunked conspiracy theories about the 2020 election. That's, a theme that runs through a lot of his second term, is to actually rewrite the outcome of the 2020 election and sort of the fever dream search for evidence to back up a claim, though there is no evidence, though they counted those ballots multiple times. I believe 3 different times the ballots in Fulton County were actually counted, including once by hand. Nonetheless, there's this effort to, kind of muddy the waters to make people believe that there's some kind of an active question mark involving the 2020 election. So it's backward looking, but you're right to say that it's also forward looking. And I think that's the part, where it's not entirely clear, at least to me yet, why it is the Trump administration is seeking this voter data from all across the country, from state and local election officials, and, what they would intend to do with it when they do receive it. Are they looking towards a kind of mass purging of the voter rolls or something like that? Again, there's also, to me, this kind of chilling question of, are we looking at a kind of sneak preview of a future? If you really wanted to call into question, elections, I mean, a scary scenario that we've all heard talked about would be that the federal government, seizing upon some kind of pretext, seizes voting machines before elections are called. I do think that's one of Trump's takeaways from 2020 is you've got to stop it before they count it, before the votes are certified, and make it maybe impossible in key contested elections to have people confident in results, so that, if the control of the House of Representatives is close or up in the air, you could actually see a scenario where they throw it into enough doubt, that you can't reliably certify the outcome. So lots of scary scenarios that the raid in Fulton County suggested to all of us. And then just one final thing to throw out here, because I would love to know what, everyone thinks about this, is the role of Tulsi Gabbard. My gosh, it's not, I think we've forgotten what a shocker that is to have the head of national intelligence. Like, in this country, that is a bright red line. You do not have intelligence officials whose job it is to collect foreign intelligence involved in potentially domestic intelligence gathering and domestic political
people
operations.
Had forgotten about her.
Yeah,
People
that was
actually-
a holy shit thing.
Yeah. So let's, Nate, if you want to address that, but I also want to turn to gerrymandering. You've actually worked with multiple multiple states on their redistricting. The situation is fluid. For example, the Virginia Supreme Court just allowed a special election on redistricting in the state that could lead to 4 more seats for Democrats. When we get to November, which party is most likely to gain the advantage of redistricting? If you have any comments on what
Well, I
Susan
think the
said, too.
Republicans are going to gain a little bit, but not as much as they had hoped for when they started down this path. And so I think Gavin Newsom's decision to gerrymander California then sort of was the firing shot for the Democrats so that they were willing to retaliate, which frankly was not a predictable outcome. I mean, it wasn't sure that the Democrats would be able to get their act together, let alone that they'd be able to get it passed on these referenda ballots. And we'll see whether that happens in Virginia. But if you sort of do the math, it looks like the Republicans may have gotten a few seats, but that's all with the caveat that we think that this is going to be a close election in the fall. There's the possibility that this whole strategy backfires on the Republicans because they've spread their supporters too thinly, because that often happens when you draw these lines. Over the long term, though, I think there is reason to be concerned that now a pretty important norm has been broken, that incumbent parties can redraw the lines to their advantage if they don't like the way the electoral winds are blowing. If I could say one thing on the voter matching, because I think Susan said, well, we don't know what they're trying to do with the data that they're gathering from the states or they're requesting. I think we do, which is, and it's exactly what Susan suggested, which is that they're going to use the data that they get from the states to match up against something like, a Doge database or a DHS database to then allege that, millions of people are ineligible that are on the rolls, whether it's people who are out of state, people who have died, people who have moved. But it's one more sort of ingredient in the recipe to prove that the election is fraudulent even from the get-go. And anyone who does these kinds of matchings, and Natalie can attest to this, there's always errors. In fact, there are usually more errors than there are, positive identification of these false voters because, people have the same names, people have the same birthdays. There's all kinds of things that get screwed up. And given the way that they've tried to sort of join together all these federal databases, you can easily see how that could be relevant if they're trying to go after the voter rolls.
And they want the data to create a pretext for alleging fraud. That's really what's happening in order to create a case, even if it's specious at the start. Natalie, the Trump administration, it's suing 24 states for that data, including California. They a lot of resistance to it. Explain how those records are kept for people to understand and maintained at a county level, and then tell us how they could be misused if that was their goal, if they're even going to get them.
So you all know that we do sell the voter roll, and it has to be for a specified purpose. It needs to be for an election purpose, political, journalistic, or governmental purpose. And if you can't articulate what your purpose is, then you don't get a copy of the voter roll. When you do receive one, it does not have key pieces of personal identifying information that we use for registration and that are used for sort of more sophisticated list matching programs like ERIC.
So very quickly, explain what ERIC is.
ERIC is the Electronic Registration Information Center. It's a consortium of states that agree to share data and share resources for when those voters do move across state lines. So you don't get an image of the signature. You do not get the last 4 of the social security. You don't get the driver's license number. And I think that's where the fight is. I believe that the administration wants that personal identifying information. And that is a recipe for identity theft. We take it really seriously. We do not give out that information to anyone. And it is maintained in California anyway, through an election management system that is connected to the statewide database. There is information that is flowing in between, and the registration roll changes daily. So when you get a voter roll, that is what people were registered at that moment. It could be some people die the next day or become disqualified for some other reason. So Nate is absolutely right.
And how could it be misused by the administration? If a scenario, give me one scenario.
Well, I mean, it could be mistakenly, like a voter's file could be mistakenly matched to someone who may be in what's known as the SAVE database. You'll forgive me, I don't know the exact acronym, but the SAVE database is kept by the federal government, and it has a list of folks who are not citizens. there could be a situation where it erroneously, sort of targets that person as being a non-citizen.
Can I just jump in on this whole question of matching?
Sure.
Um, I, I want to reiterate something Susan said at the outset, which is that you can't sort of look at each one of these steps in isolation as if this is a
Hmm.
cause for some particular action that's going to happen on election day. All of this
Hmm.
is sort of spreading bets as how you might create doubt in the election, both going in and then
Correct. Yeah.
afterwards. And so,
Mhm.
if the narrative that comes out of these voter matching efforts is that there's all these non-citizens that are on the rolls, or dead people on the rolls, or that's just somehow all screwed up, that's the narrative you take in to cast doubt on the election. There will be, court action if those efforts are trying to purge people from the rolls, or if it leads to challenges in the polling places. But each one of these things that's happening, whether you're talking about Fulton County, you're talking about the matching, or other kinds of efforts with these executive orders, is all about creating the kind of grounds for contesting the election beforehand.
Right, which is the point. So let's talk about the actual elections themselves. Then one of the main fears for Democrats is that Trump will use ICE or National Guard to physically intimidate voters. Susan, what would that look like in practice, and what's the likelihood that it'll happen, and where?
Well, that's right. You're not necessarily going to see this happening all over the country. One of the things about our elections over the last few decades, right, is the gradual winnowing down of competitive districts and states in the country. And I think that's one of the reason this, incredible polarization is one of the reason why we're having this crisis in the first place. But it also means that if you want to go after the elections, you don't, you have a more limited number of places where you need to do it. And in that respect, I thought it was really notable that Trump a few weeks ago said that he was, he talked about he wanted to nationalize, he used that phrase, nationalize election in 15 states. Now, he didn't say what 15 states or, where's that number coming from. In recent years at the presidential level, we've shrunk down to basically 6 states or even 3 states that have made the difference in the last several presidential elections. So we all know what those states are that are our competitive states. Add a few more states where there are highly competitive congressional districts or Senate races, and maybe that's how Donald Trump got to 15. And again, to be clear, the Constitution is silent on many things, but it's very not silent on the
Yes,
the notion that it's the states that have the
the right to
responsibility to
maintain.
regulate the time, place, and manner of elections. So that's first of all. But that same week, Trump was talking about nationalization. You also had Steve Bannon, MAGA podcaster, former Trump strategist out there saying, that let's be clear, let's send ICE right to the polling places, and we're not going to let Democrats steal this election again. If you combine these sort of threats to, in effect, militarize polling places. And again, you wouldn't have to do it all over the country, but just in
Just in
targeted
certain
places
places.
where
What's
there
the
might be
likelihood?
immigrant
The
voters.
likelihood where it will happen that they have this plan. I mean, Steve Bannon says a lot of things, but
Exactly.
yeah.
Exactly.
So what's the likelihood, do you see?
Well, I mean, first of all, we have to say that Trump has already made it clear in how he has been deploying these ICE forces already. He's using them in democratic cities and democratic states as an instrument of sort of retribution, in effect, or punishment of his political enemies. So, they would be looking to do this in places where there are large numbers of potential immigrant voters who might be scared off by the presence of ICE. And, Democratic run cities are often the places in the past that Donald Trump has targeted with his rhetoric. For example, Pennsylvania has been a key swing state, in all of our recent elections. Donald Trump has been crying fraud in Philadelphia practically before anyone's voted there. Same thing in Detroit, in Michigan, which has a key Senate race on the ballot, as well as various contested House races this fall.
Mhm.
So again,
So
I think we know the map of where they might go after pretty clearly.
mhm.
Can I have a note of optimism here?
Yes, I'm gonna ask you this because Trump's, as he said he wants to nationalize election. Is that just legal bluster? But go ahead saying what you
Yeah,
were gonna
well,
say.
he can't nationalize the elections, as Susan said, right? The Constitution says that the state legislatures are the
Mhm.
ones that are in charge of elections. And so he can't take over the elections, but, the U.S. Postal Service, for example, is always involved in elections. And so the federal government does have a role.
Mhm. So what else could he do? Give us besides sending troops to the polls, obviously, et cetera. What are the most
Well,
effective
I'm
legal?
actually kind of optimistic that the number of seats that are going to be competitive in the fall will make it very difficult to sort of target particular areas. And so, if it's a presidential election, we know what those 7 battleground states are. But with this election, there are going to be up to 30 to 50, maybe even more competitive congressional races. So it's going to be difficult to try to target each one of the polling places. Not only is there a kind of geographic difficulty there, but there's also a temporal problem, which is that we don't just vote on election day. And so we're going to have weeks where people are going to be able to be voting, and those votes will then be, banked in offices like Natalie's. And so I do think that it's easy to be concerned about these tweets because they're so unprecedented. But there's a lot of things that would make it very difficult for the federal government to try to take over local elections.
So January 6th showed that Trump can use social media to summon his supporters, obviously. You can imagine him telling them to go protect the polling sites, and that sort of ambiguous language gives him a veneer of plausible deniability. Natalie, in 2020, a so-called Trump train of around 300 people held a rally in the parking lot outside your office and blocked the ballot drop-off box. Tell us what that was like and what you could do if similar situation occurred.
Yeah, that was I have to say, I felt a little intimidated myself. Just for a little bit of context, it was, I believe, a Sunday afternoon, and we had just sent out all the ballots by mail. And I went to the office just to catch up on a couple of things, and it was, relatively quiet until about 3 o'clock, and then I heard this rumble, and then outside I saw, a bunch of cars, and they, had set up a merch booth with a bunch of Trump branded merchandise. There was a megaphone, so talking to people about who to vote for, and free speech is something that elections officials value, but there are rules around doing so around a voting location. And we had a drop box that people wanted to use, but felt they could not access. One, they could not physically access it because there were a bunch of cars blocking the way. But some people who would try to walk up to the drop box did not feel like they could. And, that is a clear violation of the law. Normally, I would go out to folks and say, there's a drop box here. Can you please move your activities to, 100 feet or more away? But because I was alone and because there were so many people, it was a situation where I did not feel like I could, sort of go out there on my own, and no one else was in the county building. So, moving forward, I think that we advertise where all of the locations are, and we work pretty closely with our local law enforcement to let them know here's where people vote. And a voting location does include an official vote by mail drop box, and the law reflects that. You cannot do any electioneering activities or, sort of any sort of political protest within that sort of 100-foot boundary.
So imagine if the Trump train's activating on election day on a large scale.
Yeah, and I think that part of my job is not only to preserve the right to vote, but also preserve rights. And what I have told people time and again is your rights do not compete with each other. You have the right to political speech just as you have the right to vote. But there are really good reasons why there is that buffer zone around voting location. It's because this country's history of voter intimidation around the polls. It used to be way, way back in the day that you could electioneer right outside the door, and it turned out that sort of created some chaos around voting locations.
Right. So what is your preparation? You were nervous to go out and fix the problem, so people presumably weren't able to vote because if they wanted to. So people were being denied the right
Right,
to
and
vote.
in that
So what's your plan?
Yeah, in that particular situation, what we had done is we had worked with the local Republican Party to make sure that those rallies did not occur in sort of key locations anymore.
Could you stop them now?
Yeah, I mean, we could, sort of certainly try. It is a violation of the law to, purposefully electioneer for the purpose of intimidating folks, and so we would just call the police, and they would take care of it. I do not believe that there's a history of that happening in Marin County. Most kinds of electioneering are passive. It's like someone's, campaign button or a shirt, and we politely say to the voter, can you just please remove that button while you are here, or turn your shirt inside out. Some people have taken the extra step of just stripping. We don't encourage that, but it does allow folks to sort of feel comfortable in the voting location, and that they can vote calmly and free of intimidation.
So, if 2020 is any guide, Trump may do the most damage after the votes are cast, as you noted, Susan. If armed federal agents showed up to an election administration site with a warrant and demand for ballots, like they did in Fulton County, talk about how to stop that and how easy or hard would it be for the FBI to obtain another warrant? Because again, the balance of power in the House could come down to a few close elections, as you noted.
I've spoken with election experts, Kara, who say that the key is, to be prepared in advance. I was even, speaking with one election law expert who suggested that one approach some people will take this year is to get injunctions in advance to try to stop activity that they fear from the federal government.
Hmm.
Again, I'm not a lawyer, but I think heightened alert obviously has been achieved here. But, I was really
Hmm.
struck by it was almost an offhand comment that Trump made a few weeks ago in an interview with the New York Times that,
Hmm.
suggested that we may be once again overly limiting our imaginations as to what is possible here. If you're,
Hmm.
dealing
Hmm.
with people who are willing to just absolutely go completely outside of the lines of what we see as acceptable. And to
Hmm.
that end, I was really kind of blown away. But in his recent interview with the New York Times, Trump said, as an aside, "Oh, I really made a mistake in not ordering the federal government to seize election machines after the 2020 election." And, this is essentially the almost martial law scenario that was being promoted by, Sidney Powell and Michael Flynn and,
Hmm.
a lot of really just wild extremists who
Hmm.
had Trump's ear in the aftermath of the 2020 election, but who, were constrained because there were others, such as the White House counsel at the time, the attorney
Hmm.
general at the time, who were indicating they wouldn't go along with these extreme measures. But how amazing
Hmm.
that Trump is now saying out loud, yeah, I wish I had seized voting machines, after
Right.
2020. I mean, imagine, we all know the mayhem that ensued on January 6th. Um,
Hmm.
Imagine the mayhem if there weren't any duly certified results from certain states. I mean, that's the thing, is that what Trump did in 2020 was extraordinary. And that was in a situation where there were no massive, and in any way proof of fraud. There were no court decisions anywhere in the country saying, questioning the overall results of state elections. December 14th, that's the key date when states had to certify the election results in 2020. Every single state met the deadline and certified the results. I think what Trump has learned, and somebody once compared him to me to like the velociraptors in Jurassic Park, learning how to open the door. What Trump seems to have learned from 2020 is seize the machines, stop it before those results get
Stop
certified.
the count. Stop the
Yeah.
count, in other words. So, Natalie, in California, every voter, for people who don't know, is sent a mail-in ballot, and the vote counting can be slow, and that's to the advantage of Trump. Explain how vote counting works in a state like California, and explain your experience in 2020 while you or your team were counting the votes, given
Sure.
Susan's scenario.
Sure. So before I do that, I just want to sort of circle back on the voting equipment and sort of seizure of election materials. that would be a serious problem. Election security includes a strict chain of custody on voting equipment and on ballots. And, sort of specific to this issue, I have asked, our county council to provide me and my staff with training on what to do if we see a warrant and what to look for. Because, I mean, frankly, I don't know about you, but I've watched a lot of cop shows and there may be a disconnect with what I understand a warrant to be, and what you see on television. So I want to be really clear that for me and my colleagues, and likely for my peers across this country, if a warrant comes in, the first call is going to be to our attorneys, and to sort of see, what the scope is of what we are dealing with. And I
And
also
not
want to,
handing it over.
well, I mean, I want to stress that I'm an administrator. That
Mhm,
I know the law. I can tell people what the law is, and in some cases, I can even enforce the law.
mhm.
And with a warrant, we're sort of in a new world, but it would be sort of very disruptive to the elections process to not have voting equipment. It would probably be an expensive problem too. I cannot imagine that our Secretary of State would continue to allow us to use equipment that was seized and broke the chain of custody. Um, but as you had stated, a lot of people vote by mail in
Mhm,
California. Anywhere,
mhm,
from 80 to 90% of the electorate that participates chooses to vote by mail, and that process does require added verification. So,
mhm,
in this state, we give voters plenty of time to submit a ballot. We send them out 29 days prior to the election. After the election, if the voter chooses to submit that ballot by mail, then we basically have 7 days to accept a timely postmarked ballot. And, sometimes people forget to sign, or, the signature does not compare with what we have on file. So we need to reach out to the voter. And so, one of the dynamics that's happening that we, try to ameliorate with through our messaging is please vote early. But what we see in California, at least, is a lot of people are choosing to cast a ballot in an envelope, by mail, with an
mhm.
official drop
Right,
box on election day, and then
right,
turn
which
around and
takes
say, "Why
longer.
haven't you counted this yet?" It's because we
Mhm,
go through the process of verifying that, you haven't voted already, that, the signature that you submit, like I said at the top,
mhm,
people provide identification when they register. And they're often registering through the Department of Motor Vehicles. So when you
mhm.
sign, it's got to match what we have on file. And
Right,
sometimes
right, so it
people
takes
draw stuff, or they just put their initials or print. They don't sign. And it takes a lot of time to sometimes reach out to the voter.
So let's assume the elections themselves are relatively uneventful. But while the counting is underway, Trump plays these cards we've just discussed. The FBI seizes the ballots, he stokes conspiracy theories, and his supporters make life hell for people counting the votes. Like Natalie, and Speaker Johnson refuses to seat certain members so that Republicans maintain control of the House. What happens then? Let's start with Nate, then Natalie, then Susan.
All right, so technically, what happens is that uh, the Congress is impaneled on January 3rd.
Hmm.
Each one of these folks comes with their sort of certificates of election, saying, "Here, I'm the person who won this,"
Hmm.
and so in the ordinary course of things, you would have certain people who would be sort of clearly members of Congress who would then vote to if there's someone who objects to one of the elections of each one of the other members of Congress. And so there have been times in our history where Congress, which is empowered under the Constitution to determine the qualifications of its members, then rejects the certificate of someone and says they can't be seated. The problem is we've never been in a situation where who controls Congress is actually in doubt. The first votes that are taken are to appoint the speakers, so we don't necessarily even have a speaker, and so we are walking in totally new constitutional snow at that point, right? This
Mhm.
is a very different situation than even the January 6th uprising from 5 years ago. And so the question is whether, say, after the election, but before Congress is going to be seated, whether there's somehow a new law that would be passed that would try to deal with this issue of seating electors who allegedly were elected under fraudulent conditions.
And which they could do unless they don't have unless people resist it, presumably.
It's not clear what's going to happen if all these people show up and then there's an effort to, say that there is no majority. The question is whether there will be new rules passed in the lame duck period that then would, give Mike Johnson unprecedented power. But, generally speaking, the House, disappears after the election and then it has to reappear on January 3rd, according to, the processes that have been in place for over 200 years.
Right.
I mean, then we are in really dangerous territory, right? I mean, and then we're talking about an election that was run, and then as in other parts of the world, someone, a leader then rejects the elections and then
Mhm.
tries to cancel the vote.
Right. What about you, Natalie? How do you look at this?
I assume that folks up to this point who have doubts would have come to an office like mine. And I think, one of the most important things that we do as elections officials is we open up the process to the public. You can see how we are processing ballots, you can see how many ballots that we have. Under the California Voter Bill of Rights, you have the right to ask questions about the elections process and receive answers from the elections official. And we spend a lot of time educating the public. So if there was some sort of doubt as to the election results, I would assume that we would have a high level of contact with our lawyers, with the Secretary of State. We may be asked to, sort of provide statements to the court or, even testify as to our process. And this all would very likely happen once the election results would be certified. In California, we've got up to 30 days to certify. Many of us are done before then, but yeah, we would have to, continue to do what we always do, which is show our work.
Let me just say that it's not as if the courts are going to be silent in this, right? I mean, in the event that there's an effort to try to undermine the vote, but you're going to see action before the election, you'll see action on election day, and then you're going to see actions afterwards in the event that there's an effort to undermine the vote. And the courts have been a kind of shining light on in election litigation, but in a bipartisan way. You've seen Trump appointed judges.
Yeah.
Obama appointed judges have been sort of buttressing our democracy.
Right. So speaking of showing work, just for people who don't know, Natalie has had MAGA observers demanding to stand closer, using binoculars, taking pictures of signatures, and borderline harassing you and voters. Just to be clear. But Susan, go ahead on this question.
Yeah, I mean, look, right, we're already in a dark place because we're trying to contemplate scenarios that have never happened
Right.
before in American history. So that's part of it, right? Is
Right.
just
But
we're
what's the political
we're off the
temperature
grid
for
here.
this?
I think, again, certification is really key, as it was in 2020. It's also true. It's not just at the presidential level, but also House and Senate races have to be certified by the states. So we don't know the map yet of what would be contested. But, the scenario we're talking about here is presumably where the House of Representatives, where control is very close. And so it would depend, actually, to a certain extent, on in what states are the races that are very close. Because if those are states that have Democratic governors and Democratic state election officials and Democratic legislatures, it's going to be very hard to do what the Trump administration might want to do. If those are states that are more, evenly divided or where there's Republican officials, okay, then the question is what kind of Republican officials? We've seen, by the way, Republican officials in many states, even if they supported Trump at the national level, who have had more backbone than their national colleagues, not just in Georgia in 2020, but also look at what happened in Indiana, where Republicans, very conservative Republicans, refused Trump's efforts to redo the district line. So it depends on the map, number one. Number two, I would just also point out that Mike Johnson is also already barely in control. of the U.S. House of Representatives. So, to Nate's point about, could you rewrite the rules before January 3rd, before the new Congress? I think that would already be very, very hard to do. In fact, there's actually a scenario where over the next few months, Mike Johnson and the Republicans lose control of the House of Representatives even before the November elections. He's down to one vote right now. In the natural process of a few hundred people, many of them older, you could have, someone resigning Congress, a resignation and a death. And then all of a sudden you're talking about Democrats even possibly being in control, or Republicans, dumping Mike Johnson, who already doesn't have a lot of confidence among many of the members, and picking someone else. So, Trump may
He
want
doesn't have
to
a lot
do
of
this.
juice, is what you're saying. His juice is.
Yeah.
All right, let's wrap up by looking forward to election threats we'll be facing even after the midterms. The Supreme Court appears ready to gut Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. The ruling could come too late for the states to redraw their districts in time for the midterms, but the consequences could be dire for Democrats in 2028 and future elections. Nate, game this out for us. What do the Democrats' chances in the House look like without Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act?
Well, if the laws of political physics haven't been sort of completely unended in the last 10 years, the Democrats should win somewhere between 20 and 40 seats, which is to say that with people having a pretty low view of the economy and low presidential approval, that should be the kind of expected shift in the House. Now, gerrymandering may blunt some of the natural forces that would lead to a Democratic takeover in a midterm election. But it would the amount of advantage the Republicans are getting is not that significant. Over the long term, when you're talking about the decline of Section 2, this has been the main piece of legislation that has provided for majority minority districts, for minority opportunity districts, so that Black and Latino communities are able to get many more districts than they would otherwise. Um, because the Supreme Court has said that partisan gerrymandering doesn't raise any constitutional questions, it's statutes like the Voting Rights Act that have been the bulwark that have prevented certain types of gerrymandering. I do think the Supreme Court is going to gut Section 2 of the VRA. I think the writing is on the wall. And so that means that we may see some more redistricting maybe after this election, as well as we come into the 2030 round of redistricting.
Right. So far, administration have played it pretty straight. Republicans like Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger in Georgia, who's running for governor, and Stephen Richer, the former Maricopa County recorder, did their jobs in 2020 despite intense pressure from Trump and fellow Republicans. That might not always be the case. Natalie, if the election official wanted to corrupt an election, could they do it, or would it be too obvious?
I
Not
think
that you would.
no, no, never. And I mean that's serious. We all do take an oath to defend the Constitution of the United States and the
Hmm.
Constitution of our respective
Hmm.
states. So breaking that oath is a serious issue. It would take a lot of planning. It would not go unnoticed, as we saw in the case, for example, with Tina Peters. Clearly got caught, and when I read a story about Tina Peters, it was just shocking to me that
Hmm. She's from
anyone in our
Colorado,
cohort
for
would.
people.
Yes, yeah, Mesa County, Colorado. It's shocking to me that anyone would really sort of go to that lengths. So, we in California, we do have, I think, a very strong cohort that is constantly in contact. We are also in contact, on a regular basis with Secretary of State, and we all talk about what the rules are. In a place like California, you have a lot of local control over how elections are run, but we're all operating under the same laws, and we know what each other is doing. And I would venture to guess, because I'm like this, and I assume that my colleagues are the same way. If you're doing something that is way off base, we'll let you know. Hey, what?
Right.
um,
So
uh,
you're saying it'd be very difficult for election administration to
oh
purposely
yeah,
miscount votes.
yeah, yeah. It
Very,
it
very,
would
very
be extremely difficult for it to go unnoticed.
So Trump, one of the ways it gets noticed is through the press. Trump's attacks on the press have been unrelenting, as I know, as Susan knows. Many of the legacy media's owners are caving him. Just today, CBS is cutting off an interview with James Tallarico because Brandon Carr is a giant jackass. But for a large portion of the electorate, facts don't seem to matter. James Madison wrote that a popular government without popular information or the means of acquiring it is but a prologue to a farce or a tragedy or perhaps both. Very fancy quote, but absolutely holds up. Susan, how do you think about your role in the news media's role more broadly? Is it a prologue to a farce, a tragedy, or both?
Yeah, look, I mean, it was in Donald Trump himself in the 2024 election campaign said, if we don't have free speech, we don't have a country, period. And it's in against that backdrop, a very cynical statement, really, when you consider the broad array of attacks that Trump has launched, not just on the integrity of the electoral process, but, you could argue that it's going after, in a pretty systematic way, Americans' free speech rights that have been a signature move of this president. And of course, that's all in the context of maintaining power and using it. And I think that, for Trump, he sees the stakes in this fall's election as very significant to him. While some people will downplay it and say, well, what difference does it really make if Democrats take back the House? You can say that Donald Trump believes it makes a big difference. He himself has repeatedly, almost obsessively, already begun talking about it. He says that Democrats will impeach him once again if they take back the House, that, he understands there will be not only potential impeachment, but there will be oversight hearings. There will be Congress acting in a different way. It might cause him also to lose the hold over the
Hmm.
Republicans who remain
Right.
on Capitol Hill, who
No,
he's
it's
cowed.
existential. It's clear he understands it's
Absolutely. So
existential.
number one, it's existential. Number two, it's the lies and disinformation that have fueled Donald Trump and his movement from the beginning. And of course, it's lies about an election that are at the heart of this presidency. The New York Times called Trump's second term the January 6th presidency. Well, that means it's a story about lying about an election that is the foundational ideological belief of the people who are running this country right now. And so it's in that context that I think, we have this responsibility as journalists. And again, Kara, I see that as a very nonpartisan thing in the same way that our election officials, need to have rules of the road that are not benefiting Democrats or Republicans, but that it's essentially a technocratic role in our democracy. Without it, we can't have confidence in it. I feel the same way about journalism. Reporting independently without fear or favor doesn't mean saying that there's an equivalence between our two parties or everything that comes out of the mouth of a candidate has to be weighed in that context. It means being able to speak without fear or favor. And I worry that in too many communities around the country, including, sadly, the community you and I live in, the Washington, D.C., which has lost its
Mhm.
reporting about state and local elections. My husband spent more than a decade reporting
Mhm.
for the Metro section of the Washington Post, including from Richmond, Virginia, the capital of Virginia. We're losing our independent reporting about elections at exactly the moment they're challenged by the people who are running the country. So, obviously the role of journalism is an important one to spotlight in terms of the integrity of the elections.
So one of the things that's interesting is, after they dumped this James Tallarico interview on the broadcast network, CBS acquiesced instantly. They put it on YouTube a second later, which I thought was hysterical. I was like, hey, have you heard of the internet, kids? In any case, my last question, there doesn't necessarily have to be anything dramatic like ICE agents patrolling voting sites or FBI agents taking ballots for Trump's prolonged assault on our democracy to work. Between gerrymandering, voter roll purges, ID laws designed to suppress turnout, the gutting of Voting Rights Act, whatever Trump does around the midterms, we could see American democracy hurting by 1,000 cuts, right? Becoming very damaged. How do you avoid that fate?
Well, thanks, Kara. I mean, look, that's the thing about us journalists, right? We don't have to uh we're not as good at prescriptions as we are at analysis and describing the problem rather than fixing it. And I feel like that's the role for us to play in this democratic small d crisis that we have right now. I will say that in other countries that I've observed and reporting from Russia during, the beginning of Vladimir Putin's tenure, in other countries around the world where you've experienced democratic small d rollbacks, it's the role of civil society coming together, and journalism, in my view, independent journalism is part of civil society. Americans just aren't used to talking in those terms. We tend to actually buy into this very polarized, like there's Democrats and there's Republicans. And frankly, the interests of the Democratic Party, capital D, isn't always the same as the interests of the democracy, small d. And, I feel like this is a moment for civil society to come together in a pretty widespread and sweeping way, and not to wait until it's too late. Because I think that that's what happened after Donald Trump was first sworn in last year, that you didn't see the kind of civil society coming together, the resistance, the people understanding, that they needed to act collectively and stand up collectively for democratic values. That if that doesn't happen, a lot of the things that we're warning about in this podcast may come to pass.
Okay. Nate?
So a lot has to happen before we get to that apocalypse. I think that viewers and listeners need to understand that the courts have been quite active in particularly protecting the vote. And so while there's all kinds of executive orders and other kinds of threats that are being posed in this pre-election period, the system, I remain optimistic that the system is going to hold. I think over the long run that there is damage that has now been done, which is that people have lost confidence in the election infrastructure. And so long as elites send that message that that voters can't trust that their ballots will be counted, that I think that long-term distrust of the mechanics of American democracy is something to be concerned about. But as has been sort of the lesson over the last year, it's very difficult right now, about 9 or 10 months away from the election, to predict what we're going to be talking about then. And so what I tell my students is that I can't tell you that there's light at the end of the tunnel, but I can only tell you that there are going to be other tunnels.
Okay. Natalie?
Sure. I appreciate the question because I mean I hear a lot of a lot of crazy stuff that could affect the work, and what gives there's a lot of things that give me hope. And one of the big things is I'm just going to take it back to my colleagues both here in the state and in my office and across the nation. We care very deeply about a free and fair elections process where voters get to participate if they choose to do so, and that we count ballots to the fullest extent of the law. Unfortunately, nowadays we've sort of become more like referees than anything else, but the a level of planning and detail and care that we put into every single election, even in the face of, sort of intense harassment, intimidation, even threats in some cases, we are dedicated to this process. And, I would encourage anyone who has any questions to come into our office, look at our operation, see what we do. We all open up the process so people can have the opportunity to come and see the level of detail and verification that we pour into every election. We care about getting it right. We're, often, sort of forced to keep from getting too distracted by the politics of it all, and we'll continue to do so for this election and for all future elections.
All right. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate you for joining us. It's really important to talk about these issues in a relatively calm and extensive way so people understand there are things they could do. And I really appreciate, Susan, you and Natalie. I have to say, I believe in democracy because of people like you who are doing this work, despite all the difficulties you've had to face, unfortunately.
Thank you very much. I appreciate
Thanks
that.
for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much. It is heartening, Natalie, in an
I
optimistic
know.
time
I'm
to
like,
hear you.
go, Natalie. Go, Absolutely. I appreciate it. Today's show was produced by Christian Castro-Russell, Michelle Alloy, Megan Burney, and Kaylin Lynch. Nishat Kurwa is Vox Media's executive producer of podcasts. Special thanks to Eamon Whalen and Madeline LaPlante Doobie. And our theme music is by Trackademics. If you're already following the show, we get to keep our democracy. If not, we still get to keep our democracy. We're not backing down. And please go vote. Thank you for watching. See you on Monday.